Nora Wells was not the kind of person who gave up on things easily. She was 26 years old, average height, with short brown hair she never bothered to style and hands that were always a little rough from cleaning cages and hauling feed bags. She had come to Port Halvern 3 years ago on a short-term volunteer contract and simply never left. The pay was poor. The hours were long. The work was unglamorous in every possible way. But every morning she walked through the doors of the Halvern Interstellar Rescue Station and got to work without complaint, and that was more than most people could say. The station sat near the edge of the trade hub, wedged between a fuel depot and a parts warehouse. It was not a pretty building. The walls were thick gray panels bolted together decades ago and never repainted. The inside smelled like animal bedding and cleaning solution and the particular warmth that came from having too many living creatures packed into too small a space. Aliens from a dozen different species moved through its corridors every day, dropping off creatures they no longer wanted, picking up ones they had decided to claim, or simply passing through on their way to somewhere else. Nora loved it. All of it. Even the smell. Her supervisor was a tall insectoid alien named Sev who communicated mostly through clicks and had worked at the station for longer than Nora had been alive. He was not cruel, but he was practical in a way that sometimes felt the same. He made decisions based on numbers and space and resources, and he did not often leave room for exceptions. Nora respected him. She also ignored him fairly regularly, which he had gradually accepted as part of working with a human. On the evening everything changed. Nora was finishing the last of the closing checks. It was late. Most of the staff had already gone home. The lights in the main hall had dimmed to their night setting, casting everything in a low amber glow. Nora was moving through the intake corridor with her checklist, making sure every water dish was full and every latch was secure, when she heard the front door open. She walked back to the desk. The alien standing there was tall and blue-scaled with small flat eyes that held no particular expression. He was dressed in a merchant's traveling coat, the kind with many pockets, and he carried a small metal crate in one hand the way someone might carry a bag of groceries. He set it on the counter with a hard clank and looked at Nora with the mild impatience of someone who had one more errand to complete before the end of their day. "Dwarf Vaelrin," he said. His translator collar kept his voice flat and even. Undersized wings. No fire response. 40% below standard body weight. I purchased it as part of a lot 3 months ago expecting it to develop normally. It has not. It is not suitable for resale, not suitable for breeding, and not suitable for display. He pushed the crate a centimeter further across the counter. "I need it disposed of." Nora looked at the crate. It was roughly the size of a storage box. The ventilation slots on the sides were the only indication that something alive was inside. There was no movement. No sound. "What's the disposal timeline?" she asked. Her voice was calm. She had learned to keep it calm. "Tonight if possible," the merchant said. "Tomorrow at the latest." He did not wait for a response. He turned and walked back out the front door as if the conversation was already finished, which in his mind it clearly was. The door slid shut behind him. The hall went quiet again. Nora stood at the counter for a moment. Then she reached out and carefully unlatched the front panel of the crate. She opened it slowly, not wanting to startle whatever was inside. The smell of fear came out first. She had worked with enough animals to know it. A sharp, faintly metallic scent underneath the ordinary smell of a small creature that had been confined for too long. Then she saw him. He was pressed into the very back corner of the crate, as far from the opening as the space would allow. His scales were a deep charcoal gray with faint copper markings along his neck and the edges of his jaw. His body was small. Genuinely small, not just young, with the proportions of a creature that had simply not grown the way its species was supposed to. His wings were folded tight against his back and they were clearly, visibly too short for his frame. Like someone had taken a full-sized pattern and cut it down by a third without adjusting anything else. His eyes were pale amber and they were wide open, fixed on her face with an expression she recognized immediately. Pure terror. He was not hissing. He was not trying to bite or flee or fight. He was simply frozen, staring at her, waiting for whatever came next in the way that an animal waits when it has learned that what comes next is never good. Nora did not reach in. She did not try to pick him up or move him or coax him forward. She just leaned against the counter and looked at him for a long moment, letting him look back. "Hi," she said quietly. He did not move. Sev's voice came from behind her. She had not heard him come back down the corridor. "Termination is scheduled for first shift tomorrow," he said. "No adoption flag. No viable category." The merchant filed a no-contest release, which means we are not required to hold him longer than intake processing. "I know," Nora said. He is not registered in any adoptable listing. His physical profile will not generate interest. The cost of specialist care for a Valeran with his deficiencies would exceed the station's per animal budget within 2 weeks. I know, Nora said again. There was a pause. You are going to take him home, Sev said. It was not a question. Tonight, Nora said. Another pause. Sev made a low clicking sound that she had come to understand meant something like you are doing the irrational thing again and I have stopped being surprised. Then his footsteps moved back down the corridor without another word. Nora looked at the small dragon in the crate. Okay, she said softly. Here is what is going to happen. I am going to close this up just for the walk because it is cold outside and I do not want to stress you more than you already are. And then we are going to my place, which is not very far, and you are going to have a warm space and some food and nobody is going to do anything to you. She paused. I know you do not understand me. But I am going to keep talking anyway because I think it helps. It helps me at least. She closed the crate gently, latched it, picked it up with both hands. He was lighter than she expected. That fact sat in her chest in a way she did not examine too closely. She turned off the intake lights, told the overnight system she was leaving, and walked out into the cool night air of Port Halvern with a small crate in her arms and no particular plan beyond the next few hours. She named him on the walk home. Pip. She was not sure why that name and not another. It just came to her and it fit in a way she could not explain, the same way some things simply fit without needing a reason. He was Pip before she had even turned the corner onto her street. Her apartment was small and warm and quietly cluttered with the evidence of a person who spent most of their energy elsewhere. Stacks of animal care references on the table, a worn chair by the window, a kitchen that was mostly used for making tea. She set the crate down on the floor in the corner of the main room, in the warmest spot, away from drafts and away from anything that might feel like a threat. She opened it again slowly. Pip had not moved from his corner. He was still watching her. Still frozen. Still waiting. She got a blanket from the cupboard and folded it into a rough nest shape just outside the crate opening. Then she sat down on the floor a few feet away, pulled her knees up and waited. An hour passed. Maybe more. Just before midnight, Pip crept to the edge of the crate opening. He looked at the blanket. He looked at Nora. He looked at the blanket again. Then he stepped out, turned 3 small circles and lay down. Within minutes he was asleep. His copper markings caught the low light from the window. His 2 small wings rose and fell with his breathing, steady and slow. Nora sat on the floor and watched him for a long time. Nobody is getting rid of you, she said quietly. He slept on and did not hear her and she said it anyway. The first morning was the hardest. Nora woke up early before her alarm, the way she always did when something was sitting in the back of her mind. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling and then remembered. She got up quietly and walked to the main room. Pip was exactly where she had left him. Curled in the blanket nest outside the crate, wings folded tight, eyes open. He had not moved in the night. Or if he had returned to the same position so precisely that there was no evidence of it. He watched her cross the room with those pale amber eyes, tracking every step, every shift of her weight, every small movement of her hands. She stopped a few feet away and crouched down to his level. Good morning, she said. He stared at her. She went to the kitchen and made herself tea and pulled out the small container of provisions she had grabbed from the station supply room on her way out the night before. Valeran dietary basics. Protein strips, mineral powder, a soft grain mix that worked for most reptilian species as a starting point. She prepared a small dish, keeping the portions modest because a stressed animal with a shrunken stomach needed small and often, not large and once. She set it down a careful distance from him. Not too close. Not so far it felt like she was retreating. Then she sat on the floor with her tea and her own breakfast and did nothing. Pip looked at the dish. Then at her. Then at the dish again. He did not eat. She had not expected him to. Not yet. She finished her breakfast, washed her cup, got ready for her shift and left for the station. Before she left she refreshed the dish, checked the temperature of the room, and made sure there was clean water within easy reach. She came home 8 hours later to find the dish untouched. She sat with him again that evening. Same thing. Same quiet. Same careful distance. She talked a little low and even, not trying to entertain him or reach him, just filling the silence with something that was not threatening. She told him about her day. About a young feathered creature that had come in with a hurt leg and was already improving. About the way Sev had reorganized the storage room again and how nobody could find anything for 3 hours. Small things. Nothing important. Pip watched her the entire time without moving. She changed his water, said goodnight and went to bed. The second day was the same. He did not eat. He did not move from the nest except for the small necessary things that told her his body was at least functioning. He drank a little water, which she counted as progress and tried not to make a fuss about. Every time she entered the room his eyes found her immediately and stayed on her, watchful and exhausted and very, very careful. She understood it. She had seen it before in animals that had been passed around too many times, handled without care, kept in conditions that taught them the same lesson over and over, that the world was not safe and that people were the main reason why. They did not become aggressive these ones. They became still. Stillness was their defense. If you did not move, maybe nothing bad would happen. If you waited long enough, maybe the bad thing would pass. The problem with that kind of learned stillness was that it also kept out the good things. Food, warmth, connection. The animal would starve itself protecting against a threat that was no longer there. Nora knew the only answer was time. Not tricks. Not techniques. Just time and consistency and the slow accumulation of evidence that she was not going anywhere and was not going to hurt him. So she sat on the floor every evening and she waited. On the third day her friend Finn Carter came over. Finn worked as a medic at a station 2 sectors over and had known Nora long enough to stop being surprised by the things she brought home. He was broad and practical and not naturally given to sentiment, but he sat down on the floor beside her without being asked and looked at Pip with a steady, evaluating expression. "He looks thin," Finn said quietly. "He is thin," Nora said. "He was thin when he arrived. He has not eaten since I brought him home." Finn was quiet for a moment. "How long can he go?" "A few more days before I have to intervene. But I do not want to force-feed him if I can help it. It would undo everything." She kept her eyes on Pip while she talked. "He needs to choose to eat. It has to come from him." Finn nodded slowly. He understood the logic even if it made him uncomfortable. "And if he does not choose?" "He will," Nora said. Simply. No doubt in her voice at all. Finn looked at her sideways. "You cannot know that." "No," she agreed. "But I am going to act like I do." Finn stayed for an hour. He was quiet most of the time, which Nora appreciated. He did not try to approach Pip or make any sudden movements. By the end of the hour Pip had shifted his gaze between the two of them several times in a way that felt less like alarm and more like cautious assessment. A small thing. Nora noticed it and said nothing. After Finn left she prepared the evening dish and sat down again. She had her book with her this time. She read quietly, turning pages slowly, not looking at Pip directly. Just present. Just there. The lamp was warm and the room was quiet and outside the trade lanes hummed with their usual distant traffic. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Then she heard a faint sound, the soft scrape of small claws on the blanket as Pip shifted his weight. She did not look up from her book. Another few minutes. Another small movement. She could see it at the edge of her vision. He was sitting up. Then he was standing. Then he took one step forward toward the food dish and stopped and looked at her. She turned a page. He took another step. She kept reading. He reached the dish. She heard him sniff it. A long, careful sniff, working through the smell of it, checking it against something internal she could not know. Then silence. Then the unmistakable small sounds of eating. She let out a breath so slowly it was barely audible. She did not look up. She did not react. She did not want to startle him or make the moment feel significant in a way that might make him retreat. She just kept her eyes on her page and let him eat in peace, as if this was simply the way things were and always had been. He ate about half the dish. Then he stepped back and sat down and looked at her again. This time she looked up. They regarded each other across the small warm room. Nora reached out her hand slowly, palm up, and set it on the floor between them. Not reaching toward him. Not asking for anything. Just offering. Pip looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he walked forward, 3 careful steps, and lowered his nose to her palm. His breath was warm. She could feel the faint rapid beat of his pulse through his nose against her skin. He sniffed her hand thoroughly, every part of it, and then raised his head and looked at her from very close up with those pale amber eyes. She did not move. Very slowly he stepped onto her hand. Just his 2 front feet. Testing the surface, testing what she would do, testing whether the ground would hold. She held perfectly still and let him test it as long as he needed. After a moment he stepped back off and returned to his nest. He turned 2 circles, lay down and closed his eyes. Nora sat on the floor for a while longer, her hand still resting open on the ground in front of her. She thought about what Finn had said. That she could not know he would choose to eat. That she could not know it would be all right. He was right that she could not know. She had not known. She had just decided to show up every day as if the outcome was never in question, and she had kept showing up, and here they were. It was not a complicated method. It was just the only one she had ever found that actually worked. She looked at Pip, breathing quietly in his nest, finally asleep without the tight frozen stillness of the first 2 nights. Something in him had shifted. Not healed. Not fixed. Just opened slightly like a door that had been stuck swinging free for the first time. It was enough for today. Tomorrow she would sit on the floor again. And the day after that. For as long as it took. She turned off the lamp and went to bed. 6 weeks after Pip arrived, Nora noticed something. Every morning when she opened the curtains, Pip would climb to the back of the chair nearest the window and watch the sky. He did not do it in a restless way or an agitated way. He just sat there very still and watched. The trade ships moving in slow arcs above the hub. The small winged creatures that nested in the station roof across the street, darting and looping in the early light. Anything that moved through the air above him. He would watch for a long time. Then he would look down at his own wings. Then he would look back at the sky. Nora had seen that look before in animals that understood something about themselves they had not yet found words for, or in Pip's case, sounds. It was not sadness exactly. It was something quieter and more specific than sadness. It was the look of a creature that knew what it was supposed to be able to do and was not yet sure if it ever could. She decided they were going to find out. She started small the way she always started. The first morning she simply sat beside him on the floor and gently unfolded his wings herself, one at a time, moving slowly and stopping the moment she felt any tension in his body. He let her. He was used to her hands by now and had learned over 6 weeks that her hands did not hurt things, they just moved carefully around them. She held each wing at full extension for a count of 10, then folded it back. Left side, right side, both together. That was all. 5 minutes and done. He looked at her afterward as if waiting for more. "That is enough for today," she told him. He flicked his tail in a way she had come to recognize as mild disagreement. She did it again the next morning. And the morning after that. Each day she held the extensions a little longer, added gentle resistance so the muscles had something to push against, and began working on the joint where the wing met the shoulder, which on a normal Valerin would have been thick with flight muscle but on Pip was underdeveloped and tight. He was a good patient. He complained sometimes, a low grumbling sound when a stretch pulled at something stiff, but he never pulled away and he never snapped. And on the morning she was running late and tried to skip the session he would plant himself in front of her feet and refuse to move until she sat down and did it properly. Finn started joining them on weekends. He had a background in physical rehabilitation from his medic training and he brought a practical eye to the exercises that Nora found useful. He measured Pip's wingspan every 2 weeks with a soft tape and recorded the numbers in a small notebook without comment, but Nora could read his expression well enough to know the measurements were moving in the right direction. A month into the exercises she introduced gliding practice. She started with the couch. She would sit on the floor a short distance away with her arms out and Pip would drop from the couch cushion and glide the small gap to her. It was barely a meter. It was not impressive by any measure. But it required him to open his wings and trust his own body to carry him, and that was the part that mattered. The first time he did it he looked genuinely startled that it had worked. She laughed. He chirped and immediately climbed back up to do it again. They extended the distance gradually over the following weeks. From the couch to the kitchen counter. From the counter to the chair by the window. From the chair to Nora standing in the middle of the room with her arms raised. The landings were rough at first, too fast, too steep, ending in an ungraceful scramble up her arm rather than a clean arrival. But the flights themselves were getting steadier. He was learning how to angle his wings for the air, how to read the small currents in the room, how to slow himself without dropping. At the station word had spread. Nora had mentioned the exercises to a couple of colleagues in passing, mostly because she needed access to the low-gravity therapy pool 2 mornings a week and had to explain why. The reaction was not warm. Sev said nothing but his silence had a texture to it that was not encouraging. A Valerin breeder named Lord Casson was passing through the station on trade business that month and somehow heard about what Nora was doing. He appeared in the corridor outside the pool room one morning while she was working with Pip in the shallow end, supporting his body in the water while he moved his wings in long, slow strokes. Casson stood at the window and watched for a moment. "You understand," he said through the glass, loud enough to be heard, "that the wing structure of a dwarf variant is not a training problem. It is a biological fact. No amount of exercise changes the underlying bone ratio." He said it in the pleasant tone of someone explaining something to a person who did not know better and never would. "You are investing considerable time in an outcome that is physically impossible." Nora kept her eyes on Pip and her hands steady under his body in the water. "Thank you," she said in the same pleasant tone. Casson waited for more. She did not give him more. After a moment he walked away. Pip had gone still in the water during the exchange, picking up on the tension the way he always picked up on everything. When Cassin's footsteps faded he looked up at Nora. She smiled at him. "Back to work," she said. He went back to work. The alien staff were less direct than Cassin but the attitude was the same. She caught the looks between colleagues when she carried Pip through the station. Heard the comments when they thought she was out of earshot. Defective animal. Sentimental human. Waste of the pool schedule. She let it move past her the way she let most things move past her, without grabbing hold. What mattered was not what they thought. What mattered was what Pip could do. And what Pip could do was growing every week. By the third month he was gliding 6 feet consistently and landing cleanly more often than not. His wings had developed visible muscle along the leading edge. He was faster in the water and his endurance had more than doubled. He still could not achieve the long powerful flight of a full-grown Vailrin. His wings would probably never give him that. But Nora had quietly stopped thinking about what he could not do and started paying attention to what he actually did. What he actually did was extraordinary in its own quiet way. He was precise in the air in a manner she had never seen in a standard Vailrin. Where larger dragons used power and wingspan to move through space, Pip used angles and timing. He found the air currents in a room and worked with them instead of pushing through them. His turns were sharp and clean. He could stop mid-glide in a way that should not have been possible for his wing ratio, hovering for a half-second before dropping to a landing. Nora wrote it all down in her own notebook. The evening it all came together she was not even in the room. She had gone to the kitchen to make tea, leaving Pip in the main room in the last of the evening light. She was only gone a few minutes. When she came back she stopped in the doorway. Pip was at the windowsill. Standing on the narrow ledge, facing the glass and the darkening sky beyond it. His wings were open. Not stretched by her hands, not positioned for an exercise. Open on his own, trembling slightly with the effort of holding the position. He did not know she was watching. He jumped. Not a glide from a low surface to her waiting arms. A real jump, off the sill into the open air of the room. His wings caught, adjusted, caught again. He swept the length of the room in a low fast arc, banked hard at the far wall with a precision that made her breath catch, leveled out and glided back toward the window. 4 full meters. Clean and fast and entirely his own. He landed on the sill and spun around immediately, and found her standing in the doorway. She raised her hand and gave him a thumbs up. He opened his mouth and chirped so loudly, so completely, so full of something that could only be described as joy, that the neighbor knocked on the wall from the other side. Nora stood in the doorway with her tea going cold in her hand and felt something settle deep in her chest. Nobody had believed it was possible. Pip had simply not been informed of that fact. The Halverin Species exhibition came once a year and filled the whole trade hub with noise. It ran for 3 days across the main exhibition hall near the center of the hub, a vast open structure with high ceilings and wide floor space that could hold hundreds of species and thousands of visitors without feeling crowded. Traders came. Breeders came. Researchers came. Collectors and enthusiasts and curious travelers and families with small children who wanted to see things they had never seen before. It was loud and bright and busy and smelled like 100 different worlds all pressed together in one building. Nora had attended every year since she arrived at Port Halverin. She liked the energy of it. She liked seeing species she did not recognize and reading about them on the information panels and filing the knowledge away for later. She went alone usually, moving at her own pace, stopping wherever something caught her attention. This year was different. Finn had raised an eyebrow when she told him she was taking Pip. To the exhibition, he said. Yes, she said. With the breeders and the collectors and Lord Cassin's entire display team. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Nora, those people are not going to be kind. I know, she said. They will say things about him. In public. In front of a crowd. I know that too. Finn looked at her for a long moment. He had known her long enough to recognize the expression she was wearing. It was not the expression of someone who had not thought things through. It was the expression of someone who had thought things through completely and arrived at a conclusion that other people might find uncomfortable. You want them to, he said slowly. You want them to say it all in public. Nora clipped Pip's small travel harness and checked the fit along his shoulders. I want Pip to have an audience, she said simply. That is all. Finn picked up his jacket and said nothing further. He came along anyway. They arrived mid-morning on the second day when the hall was at its fullest. The crowds moved in slow rivers between the display areas, pausing to watch demonstrations, leaning over barriers to look at creatures in carefully designed habitat displays. The noise was considerable, Voices in dozens of languages, the sounds of animals, the hum of display equipment, the occasional burst of applause from somewhere deeper in the hall. Pip rode on Nora's shoulder, harness clipped, tail wrapped loosely around her collar. He was alert, ears up, watching everything with the bright particular focus he brought to anything new. He was not afraid. He had not been easily afraid for some months now. He turned his head from side to side, taking in the smells and sounds of the crowd with what looked like genuine interest. Nora felt him shift his weight on her shoulder and knew he was looking at the ceiling. It was very high. She could feel him assessing it. "Not yet," she said quietly. He settled. They found the Veilrin display near the center of the hall. It was not difficult to find. Lord Casson had positioned it prominently and invested considerably in making it impressive. 3 full-grown Veilrins stood on raised platforms behind a low barrier, each one enormous and gleaming under the display lights. Their scales had been polished to a high shine. Their wings, when extended for the crowd, filled the air with a sound like heavy fabric snapping in wind. On command they produced controlled streams of blue fire that drew a collective sound of awe from the gathered spectators. They were magnificent creatures. Nora could admit that honestly. She had nothing against the dragons themselves. They were beautiful and well cared for and clearly trained with skill. The crowd around the display was 3 people deep in every direction. Lord Casson stood to the side of the display in a long coat that matched his station, greeting people who approached him with the comfortable ease of someone entirely at home in their own importance. He was tall and well-dressed and he smiled the way people smile when they are certain of how things stand. He noticed Nora from across the display area. His eyes moved from her face to Pip on her shoulder and back again. The smile did not disappear exactly. It just changed quality slightly, the way a smile does when it finds something it considers amusing. He said something to the person beside him. That person glanced over and said something back. There was a short laugh between them. Nora kept walking toward the display. Casson raised his voice as she reached the barrier, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "The human conservationist," he said pleasantly. "And her project." His eyes settled on Pip with the assessing expression of someone calculating value and finding very little. "Still the same animal, I see. No growth to speak of." Several people in the crowd turned to look. Pip looked back at them calmly. "He has grown quite a bit actually," Nora said. Her voice was even and pleasant. Casson smiled at the crowd with the air of someone sharing a private joke with a large number of people at once. "The dwarf variant," he said in the tone of a man explaining something educational. "Genetic deficiency. Undersized wings, absent fire response, well below standard mass. A regrettable anomaly that responsible breeders identify and remove early." He glanced at Pip again. "Though apparently some find sentimental value in keeping them." A few people in the crowd laughed. Not cruelly exactly. The way people laugh when someone confident says something with authority and they are not sure if they are supposed to question it. Nora looked at the crowd. Then she looked at Pip. Pip was already looking at her. He had been watching her face since Casson started talking. She knew that look. It was the same look he gave her every morning at the windowsill before his flight exercises, the same look he gave her before every new thing she asked him to try. He was not waiting for permission exactly. He was checking in, making sure she was with him. She unclipped the harness. "Go ahead, Pip," she said. For 1/2 second nothing happened. Then he launched off her shoulder and the air in the hall changed. He did not fly the way the full-grown Veilrin flew. He did not sweep in long powerful arcs or ride his own wingspan across the open space above the crowd. What he did was something faster and sharper and so completely different that it took the crowd a moment to even process what they were seeing. He banked left at a speed that seemed too fast for his size and pulled into a tight rising spiral above the display area, and at the top of the spiral he stopped, hovering, wings beating in a rapid precise motion that held him perfectly still in the air for 3 full seconds. Then he dropped into a corkscrew dive that made several people in the crowd instinctively step back, pulled out of it 6 feet above their heads, and turned the pull-out into a horizontal sweep across the full width of the hall. He was not performing. That was the thing that struck Nora every time she watched him fly. The full-grown Veilrin on their platforms were performing. They were executing trained behaviors in sequence for a watching audience. Pip was doing something else entirely. He was simply flying because he loved it. Every turn looked like an idea he had just had. Every dive looked like something that occurred to him mid-air and seemed worth trying. He found a warm current rising from the display lights and rode it upward in a loose joyful loop that had no purpose except that it felt good. The crowd had gone completely silent. Not the polite quiet of an audience watching a planned demonstration. The dropped quiet of people who had forgotten they were in a crowd at all, each one simply standing with their eyes up, watching something they had not expected to see and could not quite look away from. One of the full-grown Veilrin on the display platforms turned its massive head to follow Pip's path across the ceiling. Even the trained animals were watching. Then a sound broke the silence. A small alien child near the front of the crowd, no higher than Nora's elbow, pointed straight up at Pip and laughed. A full, open, completely unguarded laugh of pure delight, the kind that only children produce because they have not yet learned to be careful about joy. The laugh spread. Not the polite applause of an impressed crowd. Something warmer and less controlled than that. People were smiling the way you smile when something surprises you into it. Pip swept back across the hall in one long final arc and landed on Nora's shoulder as cleanly as if he had never left. He tucked his head against her jaw. His whole body was warm from the effort. Nora looked at Lord Casson. Casson was looking at the space where Pip had been flying. His expression was not angry or embarrassed. It was something harder to name. The expression of a person standing inside a certainty they have held for a long time, feeling it shift under their feet without quite being ready to admit it was moving. He said nothing. Nora did not need him to. She scratched Pip gently behind the ear and turned back toward the rest of the exhibition. Finn appeared at her shoulder, hands in his pockets, looking straight ahead. "Right then," he said quietly. "Right then," she agreed. They walked on through the crowd together. 3 weeks after the exhibition, everything changed. Not loudly. Not all at once. It started with a single message that arrived in Nora's station inbox early on a Tuesday morning while she was still on her first cup of tea. The sender was listed as Dr. Ren Holt, Xenobiology Division, Outer Systems Research Institute. The subject line said simply, "Regarding your dwarf Veilrin." Nora read it twice, then set down her cup. Dr. Holt had been at the exhibition. She had seen Pip fly. But unlike most of the people who had watched that afternoon and then moved on with their day, Dr. Holt had gone back to her office and started pulling research files she had not opened in years. Old files. Pre-standardization era files from before the modern Veilrin breeding programs had consolidated what the species was supposed to look like and what it was supposed to do. She had found something. The message was professional and carefully worded, but Nora could feel the contained excitement underneath it the way you can feel heat through a closed door. Dr. Holt was asking for access to Pip. Not to take him. Not to purchase him. She wanted to take biological samples, run a genetic sequence, and compare the results against some very old data she had located in a research archive that had not been meaningfully reviewed in over 200 years. She thought Pip might be something that the scientific community had forgotten existed. Nora wrote back the same morning and said yes. Dr. Ren Holt arrived 4 days later. She was a small human woman, older than Nora by perhaps 20 years, with short gray hair and the kind of focused eyes that belonged to someone who had spent decades looking at things very closely. She carried 2 bags of equipment and a worn notebook that looked like it had been to several different star systems and not been treated gently on any of them. She sat on Nora's floor and met Pip at his level, which told Nora something useful about her immediately. Pip approached her in about 12 minutes, which was fast by his standards. He sniffed her hands, assessed her equipment bags with deep suspicion, and eventually consented to let her take a small-scale sample and a blood draw with the kind of put-upon tolerance he reserved for things he found undignified but acceptable. Dr. Holt worked quietly and carefully, and when she was done she sat back and looked at Pip for a long moment without speaking. "How did you know?" she asked Nora. "Know what?" Nora said. "That he was worth saving. Before any of this. Before the exhibition. Before anyone saw him fly." She gestured at Pip, who had moved on to investigating her notebook with his nose. "He came in as a discard. No profile. No category. Most people would have processed the paperwork and moved on." Nora thought about it for a moment. "I did not know anything," she said. "I just saw that he was frightened and that someone had already made a decision about him without giving him any time at all." She paused. "That seemed wrong. So I took him home." Dr. Holt looked at her for a moment longer. Then she picked up her notebook, gently removed it from Pip's grip, and wrote something in it. The results came back 6 weeks later. Dr. Holt published them through the Institute with a full supporting data package and a title that was precise and academic but contained within it something that felt, to Nora when she read it, like a quiet form of justice. The paper established through genetic sequencing that dwarf Veilrin were not a defective variation of the standard species. They were a separate and ancient lineage entirely. A divergent subspecies that had existed long before the modern breeding programs were established, adapted over thousands of years not for the long-distance territorial flight that the standard Veilrin were bred toward, but for agility, precision, and close-range navigation in complex environments. They had been built for a completely different purpose. The modern breeding culture had simply decided that purpose did not count. That the only version of a Veilrin worth having was the large, fire-producing, long-range kind. And so the dwarf variants had been quietly pushed out of breeding records, generation by generation, until everyone forgot they had ever been anything other than a mistake. They were not a mistake. They had never been a mistake. They were just different in a way that the culture had stopped knowing how to see. The paper moved through research channels quickly and within 2 weeks had reached audiences well beyond the academic community. Someone posted a summary on a widely read interstellar naturalist forum alongside footage of Pip flying at the exhibition that a visitor had recorded on a personal device. The footage had been circulating in small circles since the exhibition, but now it spread properly, picked up and reshared by thousands of people across dozens of systems who watched a small gray dragon with copper markings perform flight maneuvers that should not have been possible and felt something shift in their understanding of what possible meant. The station began receiving messages. Inquiries from researchers who wanted to know more. Notes from people who had owned dwarf Veilrin and euthanized them on the advice of breeders and were now sitting with that knowledge in a new and uncomfortable way. Questions from sanctuaries asking about care protocols. And from 3 different locations across the system, reports of dwarf Veilrin currently in holding facilities, alive, waiting, that the staff were no longer certain they should process as discards. Nora answered every message personally. She worked with Dr. Holt to put together a basic care document that could be shared freely. She spoke to the 3 facilities about their animals and arranged for 2 of them to be transferred to Halvern where she could oversee their initial care. Sev watched all of this from the front desk with his characteristic stillness. One afternoon he appeared in the doorway of the room where Nora was preparing enrichment materials for the new arrivals and stood there quietly for a moment. "I have read the paper," he said. "Good," Nora said without looking up. "It is thorough. The methodology is sound." He paused. "I have also reviewed my own intake records for the past decade. There were others. Dwarf variants. I processed 11 termination orders." Another pause, longer this time. "I followed standard protocol on each occasion." Nora set down what she was holding and looked at him. Sev's expression was not one she had seen on him before. His mandibles were held very still in the way they went when he was carrying something heavy internally. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead," she said. "When you took the animal home that night, you did not have this information. You did not know what he was. You could not have known." He looked at her steadily. "Why did you do it?" Nora considered the question for a moment. Not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the real one and not a simplified version of it. "Because he was small," she said. "And he was scared. And someone had already decided that he did not matter before he had a single day to show anyone what he was." She picked up her work again. "That is the part one could not get past. Not what he could or could not do. Just that he had already been written off before anybody looked." Sev stood in the doorway for a long moment. "I understand," he said finally. And from his tone Nora believed that he did. The message from Lord Casson arrived on a Friday. It was formal and professionally worded, and attached to it was a financial offer that made Finn go very quiet when Nora showed it to him. The sum was large. Not just large for a single animal. Large by any reasonable measure. Casson cited the scientific significance of the animal, the research value, the opportunity for properly resourced study in a controlled environment. He noted that he was uniquely positioned to support such work. He noted it twice. Nora read the message once. Then she wrote back 4 words, read them over, decided they were exactly right, and hit send. Not for any price. She added have a good day because she was not impolite. Then she closed the message and went back to work. Finn read the reply over her shoulder and made a sound that was mostly exhale. Across the room Pip was lying in a patch of warm light from the window, tail moving slowly, watching dust move in the air above him with the deeply contented expression of a creature that had no idea it had just been the subject of a very large financial transaction and would not have cared in the slightest if it had. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled and went back to work. 1 year. Nora stood in her kitchen on a quiet morning and thought about that. 1 year since a merchant had set a small metal crate on the counter and walked away without looking back. 1 year since she had carried that crate home through the cold night air of Port Halvern and sat on her floor and waited for something small and terrified to decide she was safe. 1 year of mornings on the floor. Of wing exercises and pool sessions and slow careful progress that nobody had believed in except her and Finn and eventually, gradually, Pip himself. She looked across the room. Pip was already awake. He was sitting on the back of the chair by the window the way he always sat in the mornings, watching the sky come light. His copper markings had deepened over the year into something richer and warmer, catching the early sun in a way that made him look like he had been hammered out of something precious. He was still small by any Valeran standard. He would always be small. His wings were still shorter than they should have been by the measurements in every official reference document she had ever read. He was also the most studied dwarf Valeran in the known systems, the subject of a paper that had changed how an entire species was understood, and the reason that 9 other dwarf Valeran were currently alive and in care across 3 different facilities instead of processed as discards. He was also, at this precise moment, stealing her hair tie off the counter without looking at her, with the elaborate casualness of someone who believed that if they moved slowly enough the act became invisible. "Pip," she said. He froze. "Put it back." He put it back with the dignified expression of someone who had never intended to take it in the first place and was frankly a little offended by the suggestion. She smiled and finished her tea. She had planned this morning for 2 weeks. Not in a complicated way. She had not told anyone except Finn, who had offered to come and then understood without being asked that this particular morning was meant to be just the 2 of them. There was no event today. No researcher visit, no press inquiry, no facility coordination call. She had blocked the morning in her schedule simply as personal time, which Sev had approved without comment in a way that felt like its own quiet acknowledgement of what the date meant. She clipped Pip's harness out of habit and then looked at it in her hand for a moment. Then she set it back on the hook. He watched her do this with immediate attention. His ears came up. He looked at the harness on the hook and then at her, and the quality of his stillness changed into something that was almost a question. "Not today," she said. "Today you fly free." She picked up her jacket and held out her arm. He stepped onto it and walked up to her shoulder and settled there, tail finding its usual comfortable wrap around her collar. She felt the warmth of him against her neck, the small solid weight of him that she had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the things that have simply become part of how life feels. They took the stairs to the roof. The rooftop access at Port Halvern Station was not a beautiful space by design. It was a flat maintenance platform with a low railing and equipment boxes bolted to the corners and the general appearance of somewhere that existed for practical purposes and had never been asked to be anything more. But at this hour, in this light, with the trade hub still quiet below and the sky above shifting from deep blue into the first pale gold of morning, it was something else entirely. The air was cold and clean. The city below was just beginning to wake, the first lights coming on in the buildings across the hub, the distant sound of early traffic in the lanes above. The sun was not yet fully up, but its light was already spreading across the horizon in long warm bands that touched everything they reached and changed its color. Nora walked to the railing. She lifted Pip from her shoulder and set him on the railing's edge, facing outward toward the open sky. He stood very still. She stood beside him and they both looked out at the morning together, the same way they had looked out the window 100 times from the chair below, but with nothing between them and the sky now. No glass. No walls. Just the railing and the open air and everything beyond it. Pip's wings shifted. Not the tight defensive fold of a frightened animal. The slow deliberate opening of something that had learned to trust its own strength. He spread them to their full extension, both wings open wide, and held them there in the morning air. Nora did not say anything. She did not need to. He jumped. He went up first, which he almost never did, a sharp climbing burst that took him above the roofline in seconds. And from up there he turned and swept back over the platform in a long low pass so close that she felt the air move from his wings across her face. Then he was gone again, banking hard left over the edge of the building and down along the exterior wall of the station in a steep dive that made her stomach lift briefly before he pulled out of it 30 feet below and came back up on a rising current with his wings fully extended and his whole body angled into the climb like something that had been designed specifically for joy and had finally found enough sky to use properly. She watched him and felt something settle in her chest that had no precise name. He looped. A wide, unhurried loop that took him out over the hub and back, and at the top of it he hovered, the way only he could hover, wings moving in that rapid precise pattern that still made researchers write excited notes in their margins. He hung in the air above the waking city and looked down at everything below him, and she thought from where she stood that he looked like something that had never been told it could not do this. Because he had not been told. Not by her. She had been careful about that. She had never told him what he could not do. She had only ever shown up and let him find out what he could. Nora leaned on the railing and thought about what Dr. Holt had asked her that day in the flat. How did you know he was worth saving? She had said she did not know. That was true. She had not known what he was. Had not known about the ancient lineage or the divergent subspecies or the research that would follow. She had not saved him because she understood his scientific significance or predicted his future. She had saved him because he was small and scared and alone in a box, and someone had already closed the book on him before a single page had been read. Humans got called irrational for that. She had heard it her whole career. Too emotional. Too attached. Investing in things that have no practical value. Wasting resources on outcomes that cannot be guaranteed. She thought about the 11 termination orders Sev had quietly told her about. Animals that had moved through the station before she arrived, before the paper, before anyone knew what they were looking at. Gone because the system had a category for them and the category said no further value. Nobody irrational enough to pick up the crate and walk out the door. Irrational was the word the galaxy used for caring about something it had already decided did not count. She had always thought that said more about the galaxy than about the caring. Below the rooftop the city was properly waking now. She could hear the hub coming alive, the first voices, the hum of transit systems spinning up, the particular sound of a busy place shaking off the night and finding its energy again. Another ordinary day beginning for everyone inside it. Pip swept back in from the far side of the hub and she tracked him across the sky, that small copper-streaked shape moving through the morning light with a speed and precision that still made her want to just stand and watch. He was not the biggest thing in the sky above Port Halvern. Not the fastest over distance. Not the most powerful or the most impressive by the measures that the exhibition crowds and the breeders and the traders used to assess worth. He was the most purely joyful thing she had ever seen fly. He came back to her in one final long arc, dropping speed as he approached, and landed on the railing beside her hands with a clean precision that would have made Lord Cassin's training team take notes if any of them had been there to see it. He folded his wings and looked at her. She looked back at him. 1 year. A crate on a counter and a merchant who had already moved on to the next thing. One cold night and a blanket nest on the floor and the decision to just keep showing up every day until something changed. She reached out and scratched under his chin. He made the low quiet sound he only made in the best moments. The one that meant something she did not have a word for but understood completely. The sun came fully up over Port Halvern and the light touched everything it reached and the small copper dragon stood on the railing in the warmth of it, looking out at the sky he had made his own. Nora stood beside him. There was work waiting downstairs. New arrivals, new cases, new creatures that the world had decided were finished before they had really begun. There always was. She would get to it. But not just yet.